Okay, let's begin our introduction for Hitler's War. Pull up a chair because this is going to be a long one, I think. This is a quirky little game. I found out recently, actually, that it was originally produced by Metagaming. Knocks another off the list of the very small list of games that I thought were Avalon Hill produced from start to finish, not contracted out like 1830 was, not taken from another company like this or Titan or many others, Britannia, Frederick the Great, whatever. Most of Avalon Hill's production that I really liked, especially from the earlier years, well, not real early, but up until the mid 80s, was done outside of the house. A lot of it was picked up from other companies. And this is one example of something that, I had always kind of thought, well, that's really clever and innovative for an Avalon Hill game. Turns out, not quite the case. All right. What this tries to do is represent the whole of the European theater in what is really a tiny map. Take a look at the hex size, etc. The scale, these aren't armies, these are army groups. And it focuses very heavily on the technology, eventually, of the war, where you have these technological spaces that you're going to be trying to either produce new kinds of units in the case, new kinds of technologies in the case of atom bombs, missiles, and such not, or reduce the value, the cost that you're going to pay per unit for the units that you buy. It takes economics into account. You'll see there's numbers all over the board. Those numbers are production centers. And then they're going to be reflected over on your chart here. A lot of the combat, ground and otherwise, is all very, very heavily abstracted here. And that's something that some people may not be too thrilled with. But I'd say the biggest worry that I have in this has to do with the technologies, actually. It's a very clever and innovative system, and we'll talk about it when we go through the rules. However, it also has the capacity to really throw the game off the rails of the historical scenario. Now, you could say the same about a lot of other of these grand strategic games, your WIF, your Advanced Third Reich, which allow you to do technological advances. But in those cases, it's usually a much, much less a part of the game than it is here. In this game, it's a significant aspect to the game. So it's hard to say that this has a strong historical backing. Basically, the best you could do is try to play it out doing historical decisions, but there's randomness in the technological side. And if you manage to get a believable result, and you often do on that side of things, then you can say, well, at least it's not too far off the rails. But here's the problem. These things can be exploited and gamed in a way that someone may be able to find, and probably has, some sort of ultimate technological progressions that they want to use in different situations that may not be at all historical anyhow. I don't have that kind of experience with the game to talk about that at all, but except to point out I'd be real worried about it. Okay, so unfortunately the Avalon Hill rulebook went with programmed instruction. I don't know if the metagaming one did, but the rulebook has a lot of problems. Probably some of them are inherited, some of them are not. And before we get more into the rulebook, let's look at some of the charts we have. We have a sequence of play right on the board, bonus there. Effects of certain things. So, for example, national morale is a factor for the British and for the Germans here in terms of what they can be affected by. And you can see certain bombing and certain political events have an effect there. What this game does not do is it doesn't worry too much about politics. That's kind of its biggest failing in a way. If you're going to do a big what if on World War II, focusing on only the technology really as the what if side of things becomes somewhat, I feel it's somewhat disappointing to not have the opportunity for the big political moves. There's also some things baked into the rules that cause some problems. For example, the way the rules are written, and there's no change in the errata. If you capture Great Britain, if you bomb them into submission or whatever, they rejoin the Allies immediately, pretty much. They'll surrender, but they rejoin. And I may be tweaking some of the rules as I go. You've got the research rules kind of summarized here with the chart that's going to be handling that. We'll take a look at that. Different combat capabilities for the different types of units, and there are a lot of different types of units in this. This main, this is your purchase chart, which allows you, shows which amount of resource points you're going to spend at different tech levels. But that is traced here. We really worry more about the cost of the units than some sort of tech level for the most part. Terrain effects in this sea transport, which also causes me some issues, and I may actually be playing around with that too. We'll see. Because again, I don't think, the Germans could defeat the entire Allied Navy in this game, and they still will never be allowed to transport units or supply through the Atlantic Ocean. And that disturbs me. At the very least, I feel like they should have, and this will help the Britain thing, some ability to transport through the North Sea if they end up defeating Britain, to keep an occupation on Britain. Anyway, that's that. We got some little spaces here to keep track of the naval operations and the strategic warfare. Some off-board boxes, essentially, running around the board. And then the important thing, these are the combat tables. You're going to have a firepower table, which is used when you actually try to reduce the strength of an enemy force. And then the more common part of the combat table is the advanced table, which is how you actually move during the combat phase. You have almost unlimited movement prior to entering combat. Wow. Oceans and such ignored. All right, but like I said, unfortunately they did it in programmed instruction, and I'm going to try to gloss over some of the rules because programmed instruction is just horrible to try to explain, to try to understand. It's just bad across the board, to tell you the truth. There's a few concepts that we should get down, though, which is that every hex in the game essentially has a garrison strength point in it, which is going to be of particular importance when you're dealing with the advanced table. If you're attacking a hex that hasn't had that garrison removed, you're going to be attacking on the defender's strength point 1 column. But you can shoot that unit and then have a more effective chance of advancing. And you shoot that unit on the firepower table there. So I wish I had the sequence of play here. Yeah. All right. So in the basic game, you don't deal with strategic warfare, and because this is programmed instruction, I'm not going to get to that until later. But that's the first thing you handle there, which is going to be primarily the strategic bombing, which is going to focus on the production centers. You're trying to remove them from the board, and you do that kind of by putting little markers to indicate that they're devastated. The other side, though, is Axis C raids, which cut into the production for the next turn for the Allies, and that can also be marked here. So if you manage to shoot down some of the shipping from the United States or whatever, even prior to when they're in the war, shipping between the Empire and also in the United States support is a major source of production for the Allies during the war. So it's important to be able to hunt that, and you can hunt that using fleets and U-boats at different times. Now the next thing is called the movement phase, This really isn't like a movement phase in any other game you see. Like I said, it's basically a strategic redeployment type situation. You can just shift all your strength points. And I haven't explained this sucker, have I? You have this record chart that gives all your different army groups on the board, and then it divides them into types of units. Now, in general, you have a 10-factor stacking limit per hex, which means most armies aren't going to be above 10. If you look carefully, this army's up at 11, 12. You say, no, that's 13. Okay, but for stacking, tactical error, this column here, doesn't count at all. You can have as much of that as you like in a hex, which caused some serious problems in the original rule set, from what I understand. Anyway, that's what you've got here. You've also got little markers for the fleet. This is your technological research track, and this is the development track. Some big ticket items like ships are hard to build. You can build them over time. That's an advanced or optional rule or something like that. We'll get to that. We're playing the whole boat here. Okay. So during your movement, you can basically shift wherever you like. It's hard to shift overseas, though. So there's certain sea areas where you have capability to transfer units, and that's recorded here. So, for example, the Allies have unlimited movement across the Atlantic Ocean. However, only 3 strength points can go to or from the U.S. or Canada. But most others are going to be, a limitation of 3 or less movement points, somewhat based on situational conditions. Now, supply is based on whether or not you have any sea movement. And this is why the Germans can never conquer Britain, even if they knock them out of the war. We'll get to that some more, too. All right, after you do movement, you hit the combat phase, and you're going to have an initial attack subphase where you announce your attacks, then you resolve any amphibious invasions, then there's defensive result, and then finally you resolve your attacks. Basically what happens is you announce everywhere that you're going to attack before you actually resolve any of them. So, for example, in the invasion of Poland, I might be attacking from here to this hex, here to this hex, and here to this hex, or something like that. That's the kind of declaration I would make, and there's no real easy way to mark that all down. But as you can see, there ain't a lot of counters on the board. So it's usually fairly easy, even on the big, push in Barbarossa. It's usually fairly easy to keep track of where you were going with your first move. Ignoring for now amphibious invasions, the defensive assault, if you're attacking a hex where the defender has an army group or a fort, he can roll on the firepower table. And what he does is he adds up the total strength points that he has in the hex that you're attacking and makes a die roll against that. Now, TAC Air can loop you around this table. Well, actually, TAC Air is a little different. TAC Air gets handled in its own combat phase, and we'll get to that in the specific rules for that. But essentially, if you have regular ground units, you just declare how many, that you're doing your defensive fire. Now, assaults, both offensive and defensive, are allowed to be done once per player turn. So if you do a defensive assault against an attack, say here, let's say the Germans are hitting the Russians here or something. If you do a defensive assault with that unit at that point, you don't get another one if another German unit comes and steamrolls you. Likewise, the attacker, the phasing player, can only do an offensive assault once per player turn. Now, here's where one of the rules ambiguities, or actually contradictions, is. The rules themselves state that if you make an assault at this point, you're not allowed to make an advance. And they also state let me see. Once all initial, The way they're worded, it may be a little bit of an ambiguity rather than a pure contradiction, but the examples clear it up fairly well. If you don't read the examples, though, like I tend often not to, you're not going to catch this, and you're going to say, wow, this game sucks. What you're allowed to do is you're allowed to launch an assault on a hex, roll a die to see if you can weaken the strength in the hex, and then you're allowed to make an advance after that during your your initial resolve attacks. And that's not absolutely spelled out clearly except in the examples. So if you're doing an assault, it's basically to reduce the amount of strength points that the enemy has in the hex. When you do the advance, what you do is you compare the number of strength points the defender has to the number of mechanized strength points that you have in the unit you're attacking with. Now, this only goes up to 10 because stacking limits are 10, and it can't go higher than that. And what you can see is with the armies that we have on the board, the Germans have one big army with 7 mechanized units. Let's see how that goes. Well, if it's got a guaranteed chance of moving into a hex with 0 or 1 strength points. But if it's going to try to go, or up to 2, if it's going to try to go for something that's bigger than that, it's going to have a hard time moving forward. If it fails in its advanced roll, it's done attacking for the turn. You conduct all your first attacks first. So you get 1 hex, and any units that advanced in that case then have an opportunity to continue performing attacks, but they're done one at a time. So you pick 1 unit and you continue its attacks either through using the assault table, which it only gets to do once, or the advance table to push their way through. When an advance captures a hex, it destroys whatever garrison is there temporarily. And we also have these little markers to indicate what hexes you control, because that's going to become kind of a mess as we go on. You also force the enemy force to retreat a hex. You push them out of the hex that you just attacked. Now, for each hex that you've successfully advanced in a turn, you're going to get a +1 on the die roll here, which means it's going to be harder and harder to keep advancing. So usually you can get a couple of hexes off of a big mechanized force, but that's about it. And given the amount of space covered by these hexes, that's pretty much likely. Special rules for some of the terrain. Let's take a look at some of this. In combat, mechanized strength points cannot be used to assault a mountain hex, and they add 2 to their dice for advancing. There's mountains all through here. There's crossing hex sides, these little arrows. Armies may cross them without need of sea transport. For the normal scenarios, you can't attack across those. You can only attack if you're doing an amphibious assault. And regular sea hex sides, again, only amphibious assault, and you're allowed to only do that if you have sea transport capability, which we get into. If you want to attack friendly hexes, well, there's a column for that, and that'll allow you to keep moving through friendly hexes. So, for example, if the Germans move to here, and then they want to move into East Prussia, they would be using the friendly hex column. And you notice, if you have no mechs, you can't attack a hex successfully if it's got any strength points. So you pretty much have to wipe out the garrison to have any chance of moving forward. Of course, you could have redeployed into a friendly hex, as it were. There's rules, of course, for the winter combat, where the Russian winter, if you Axis armies are inside the Soviet Union in winter, they have their attack and defensive assault rolls. No, they have their attack and defensive assault rolls increased. On the first winter, that's going to be +4. The second winter, it goes down to +2. And then from then on, it only goes down to +1. So they're going to have less and less trouble with the winter as they go, as they historically did. They were just terribly ill-prepared for it. Off-map boxes don't have a stacking limitation, which is why the U.S. force is so big. If you want to attack one of them, it's harder, is basically what it comes down to, because there can be huge armies in them. They count as just a super hex, though. Supply. Supply traces back to undevastated production centers. As long as you can trace to one of them, you're in supply and you operate fine under those circumstances. And you can cross through crossing hexes, but not full C, except because this is, of course, programmed instruction. They take that rule away and add new rules for when the oceans are in. This is just the Barbarossa scenario. It turns out that you can trace supply anywhere where you have the ability to move strength points at sea. If a hex can't trace a supply source, at the end of its combat phase, it's considered unsupplied, and it's captured by the opponent. Any armies in these hexes are eliminated at the same time. An army that can't trace supply at the beginning of its turn can't move or attack. All it's allowed to do is defensively assault. This is an important factor because this is how you pocket the big armies. And once you pocket them, they're helpless. And you get this really weird dynamic that's going to happen in this game, at least maybe from my naive standpoint, but where, the Germans will cut off a bunch of Russian forces, and then the Russians try to punch their way back through and break their units out. And it just ends up this really, I don't know, it seems completely ahistorical to me, the degree to which it takes place. Certainly there were aspects of this kind of pocketing, and again, maybe I'm just playing terribly to allow this kind of thing to happen, but it happens with regular effect on me. After you get through the combat phase, you go to the production and partisan phase, and that's when you're allowed to build new units. And basically you spend the production that you get each turn, which might be minus a loss, or in terms of the Russians, plus a gain for Lend-Lease, and you pay the current price for things. So for example, the current price for infantry for the Allies is going to be 3 resources each. For the Germans, it's less. I think the basic game actually has fixed costs here. Strangely, they have fixed costs for things that you don't really use in the basic game, I think. But, well, you may not get technology advances until much later on in the rules. Okay, and among other things that you can rebuild, one of them is production points. You can rebuild production points. That's going to cost you 3 production to do, and it removes the devastation markers. You pay per point. So, for example, where you have like 2 or 4 points, it could cost quite a bit to recover all of the production there. All right. Now we start getting into where the game starts getting more complex in terms of the actual rules. Now, it's always weird. This whole the firing and advance table is very, very odd. And, well, like I said, it's kind of innovative, but... well, it's very innovative. And very odd. And the two often go together, right? All right, the next scenario that they start going into focuses on the fall of Germany. It's going to require that you start dealing with naval rules here. Of course, naval rules are my big bugaboo. What do we add here? Well, the problem here is that they retract a lot of these rules later. But essentially, you're going to add these amphibious strength point types to the game. And what they do is when you actually want to do an invasion, they're going to count kind of like armor for the advance table. Now, they can't be used for attacks inland, but you are allowed to convert them into regular infantry, one-way transfer. So as your amphibious units land, presumably supporting other units, they'll eventually convert to infantry and continue to support your army inland. As you can see, though, other than for the firepower table and for defense, infantry is pretty weak in this game. You need armor to use the advance table. Let me see if I can go through the amphibious. Basically, you pick the hexes that you want to amphibiously invade. You determine a sea route, and then for each hex you travel, and this remains the same through the advanced and optional roles, you can be shot at by enemy fleets that are at sea. Those are going to be actually on the board because I'm playing the fully advanced game. But basically, any hex you travel through the Atlantic Ocean, if the British fleet is not in port, if it goes out to sea, no matter where it is, it's going to be able to fire its full firepower value at you, which is quite large, actually. I've got 8 points of firepower there, which will be just hitting every hex there. Now, that gets more complicated because we start using, because the naval combat, the naval rules add the ability to escort fleets, and the escorts will take the hits before the invasion itself does. You can do amphibious invasions even if you can't trace movement or supply across the sea route. And in particular, here they note that the sea supply routes only work where you have movement point transfers, which means you bomb all Britain's hexes, they surrender, and then they switch back over to pro-allied. And you can't keep troops there, you can't do anything. If you invade Britain, you will lose whatever you leave there, whatever advances into there. All very, very ugly from my point of view, in a game that's got such what-if potentials to not allow you to do a successful Sea Lion. And again, I probably want to try to play with the rules to try to fix that. When you do perform an invasion, if you're invading a hex that's not adjacent to a hex that's friendly to the attacker, the defender is going to get coastal air fire. And that's listed as 6 firepower points, but later the rules change so that becomes 6 TAC air points for TAC air engagements, because TAC air interacts differently from how it is described in the original couple of sides of programmed instruction crap. In off-map box, that firepower strength is increased to 10 for the TAC air, I guess. And any losses that are created from that firepower table are going to be taken at least 50% on amphibious invasion units. Now, you can't amphibiously invade without these amphibious units. In fact, they're the only thing that allow you to advance into the hex. You do have the ability, though, somewhere to do an assault on the invasion hex. The amphibious strength are the only thing that are allowed to add to the firepower table for that. And then somewhere else you're allowed to. Allied Navy can support Allied invasions. If you have Allied Naval, you're allowed to fire with firepower of 6. But again, all that changes when you play with the more advanced rules. All that gets withdrawn. Again, programmed instruction sucks. And that's all I have to say about it, because it's got the rules scattered all over the place if you need to find them, and it retracts them as you go. Okay, and it always has sucked. Let's see what else I have here. You can invade friendly coastal hexes, and those are going to be successful. We also have fortifications. Fortifications are cool little units. We have a bunch of them on the board. Unfortunately, the rules tell you to put the wrong ones. The French end up down in the Mediterranean and the English in France. Easy to fix. What they do is when you take hits off the firepower table against them, and they're allowed to fire back on the firepower table. They're allowed to do defensive fire just like regular strength points would. But when you take hits on them from the firepower table, they reduce the total number of hits by their strength. So if you're hitting a strength 7 fortification, the Maginot line here, the first 7 points of damage you do, and yeah, you can't do that many, don't count. So that thing's pretty much invulnerable because you can't really advance. You'd need 8 mechs to have any chance of breaking through there. That would destroy the fortification if you did. But that's just a sign of how ugly, Maginot is. Now, some of the other fortifications, Gibraltar and Malta, are much, much weaker. If I can find them. 2 for Gibraltar, 1 for Malta. So they're not going to reduce the damage as much. In order to construct a fort, you pay the price, whatever it is for forts. I don't think they have a technological change. So you'd be paying 5 production points per. And they're not in effect until your next turn. They are kind of offline being built for a turn. This is a 3-player game. I didn't explain that. You've got the Allies, the Soviets, and the Germans, and they really are all different players. The first scenario is 2-player. It's the Barbarossa scenario. Second player, the fall of Germany. You could play that 2-player, but once you get into the campaign games, you can't play them 2-player. They are 3-player games, pure and simple. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to try to play them otherwise. And there's very little cooperation between the Allies and the Soviets. They can't move through each other's friendly territory. They can't attack each other either, which means they can't just move into each other's territory. The one thing that you're allowed to do is some Lend-Lease. You're allowed to do Lend-Lease through here and here, up to 2 points through each. The Allies can spend production and send it to the Russians. It goes up in this little tiny box on the right there. And that's just extra points the Soviets have at the end of that. Okay. We continue into the first campaign game, which uses essentially the same rules as the scenario we just played, except it adds unaligned countries and special rules to all of them. So, for example, you have your minor Axis allies, you have your Italy. You have rules that are specific to surrender for various countries. For the Soviet Union, probably one of the most interesting of them, you have to capture all 3 of their capitals. Well, they have Leningrad and Moscow, obviously, as capitals, but Stalingrad too, just to give you a reason to go down there, because otherwise, even with all that production down there, it's not that important. Now, we don't have morale in this game yet. Notably, there's some pieces on the board that aren't in play, that aren't available to be used. The U.S., obviously, the Italians. This Panzer Army Africa is from one of the optional rules or advanced rules. It's a strength point of Italian infantry down there, just to add to that. The Soviets have specific production limitations. Now, this gets kind of weird. So they have, they're not allowed to count. They're only allowed to have 8 production points in the Soviet Union until either a Soviet or Baltic state hex is attacked by the Axis or the arrival of the Spring 42 turn, whichever comes first. Then they're allowed to count their total production in the Soviet Union, except Siberia. Any points that they gain, though, say, from taking the Baltic states, they get those, and presumably they're taking their chunk of Poland already on the board. They've taken it before the game starts. They get those and can rebuild them. When you capture something, everything is going to be devastated. They could rebuild those production centers and add them to their production. So they clearly have more than 8 Soviet production points, but that's all that they're allowed to record at the beginning of the game. Now, this is where it gets weird here. If the Soviet player attacks any hex not in the Baltic states before the restriction has been lifted, it'll be extended until there are at least 5 Axis-friendly units, hexes within the Soviet Union, or the arrival of the Spring 1941 turn, whichever comes first. Which to me sounds like if you attack, you get a bonus, because otherwise it would be Spring 42. If anything, I feel like you really need to penalize the Soviets for this, which is why I have a little 44 here in written in. I looked for the errata to see if anybody had anything on this. Nobody has anything on this. And this is a real problem in the campaign games because, well, if it's Spring 41, the Germans are actually, or the Soviets actually get an advantage by launching an attack on the Germans. What would that attack mean? Well, in terms of they get to run their production up faster earlier. It's probably historically correct if the Soviets did attack, but there's no disincentive to attack as it stands. And that really disturbs me. At the very least, I'm going to be doing Spring 42. I think even with that, there's probably very little disincentive to attack because truthfully, once the Germans take 5 of your hexes, you get your full production anyway, and you force them into an early Barbarossa. That's why I started thinking, geez, maybe that should be 44. Siberia's production isn't available until the turn after the 8 production restriction is lifted, which would mean you'd get this big additional 8 points kicking in here. Now, there's a turn where Siberia kicks up to 12. Again, that's none of your control. You don't have any influence over these things. They're fixed in the game, which in a lot of ways makes this less of an impressive what-if type generator than, say, a A3R or WIF, where you're able to build factories back there. Suez Canal, if you take this as the Germans, you cut the Indian supply points off. The Brits won't get that. The French can't build any forts until winter of 1940 inside homeland France. All right, the second campaign game starts talking about sea and air attacks are able to go in excess of 10 points, and that basically you wrap around and do it multiple times. That's pretty standard for firepower tables. So if I had 24 strength points attacking you at once, I would take 10, 20, 2 rolls on the 10 and 1 on the 4. Research and technology. This is kind of exciting. So here, you're allowed to buy research points, and I believe they cost 1 point each to move. Yeah, 1 production point each to move a research marker up. So, for example, my infantry, I could put it here at the start, and I could spend 1 point to move it up to this space. I think you're limited to spending 1 or 2 points per turn on these. I'll explain how that works. But if I spend 1 point, then I could immediately roll for a research result. And I want to get an A result. And you can see those are pretty unlikely until you get higher on the chart. Now the amount you can spend, again, the rules, if you piece the rules together, you can get the answer here, but what they come out to is you can spend 1 point no matter what on each of your different research elements. You're not going to want to do them all. You can spend 2 points in the event that someone else has at least your level of research completed or better. And there's a bonus on the die roll if, well, not on the die roll, if someone else is doing better than you in that, if they're actually a full level above you, then you count A's and B's both as A's, which is kind of cool too. So you're more likely to be able to take their production, their technology over. When the U.S. joins the Allies, and that's all fixed in the game, no diplomacy there, they get tech level 2 in atomic bomb and tech level 1 in capital ships, but only if they haven't already surpassed this, which is a real disincentive to doing any research on those 2 elements. Atomic bomb you wouldn't want to, but I could see the British being interested in getting some more shipping in play. All right, what about the fleets? Yeah. So we have, and you know I love naval rules, right? And the naval rules to this are kind of messy. So the rules for this say you have specific fleets that you put out, this is campaign game 2, that you put out in the ocean. And when two fleets are both in the at-sea box, basically you trade off. The smaller fleet does an amount of damage to the larger fleet equal to the smaller fleet's size. All very simplified. We get to something much more complicated when we get to the later rules. Naval fire now goes to whoever has control of the sea. And it's no longer fixed firepower, it's the strength of the fleet at sea, which could be quite large. The Axis also has the ability to slide, to attack Allied sea movement traced through the Atlantic. If any sea movement's being traced through Atlantic hexes, the Axis can fire at them once for each full sea hex side, as if it's an invasion. You're not allowed to do this at anywhere else, though. All right, we already talked a little bit about tactical air, but we didn't talk about how air combat is actually resolved. TAC air points only happen during an assault, defensive or offensive. And it turns into a two-step process between the air attack and then a normal assault with those air units. When you begin the assault, you commit a number of TAC air points to attack the hex. And you you have to commit at least as many air points as the enemy has there, if you have that many. If you don't, you have to commit whatever you're willing to attack with. And this is a little different because you're allowed to withhold some of your firepower here, I believe. And then you resolve an attack on the firepower table, which go only against the opposing air strength. Then you do a normal assault, and any TAC air that you didn't use in the air combat segment that you committed, add to your firepower for the normal assault, which can wrap you around. And this works the same in defensive. It also can be used in amphibious assaults, but only if the target hex is one hex away. So for example, if I was launching an invasion from this hex into this hex, they're one hex away, so I could use the TAC air that I have assigned to that army to do that. Alternatively, of course, I could be launching an invasion from up here, but I could have an army with TAC air here committed to an assault. And it doesn't even need any infantry or anything like that. It just makes the TAC air attack. That's all it's going to be able to do. Coastal air power is qualified as 6 TAC air points, or presumably 10, although they don't say that. If a hex has only TAC air in it, it's only defense here for the advanced table, and also for taking regular firepower losses, is the garrison unit. However, here's one other little thing about TAC air. If an army must retreat out of a hex, the TAC air of the advancing army, the difference between that and that of the defending army, is inflicted as additional ground losses on the defending army. So you can wipe out an army pursuing it with the air. Oh, here's the problem. You're not allowed to withdraw from France until a certain date. I don't remember where it is, but you basically can't do the Dunkirk type situation. Your British units that you throw into France, if any, they're dead. They're going to stand there dying. However you want to look at that, if it's a point that is kind of disturbing again in the historicity. I might like to allow them to withdraw. Again, tweaking the rules to this simply because I really despise seeing things be completely ahistorical. All right, paratrooper units. We haven't talked about them. So, paratrooper units are, these guys definitely, I'm not so certain of the TAC air, but these guys definitely can be used in multiple assaults, where if you have any paratroopers and paratroopers are expensive, by the way. I mean, at 6 points each, they're the same as mech units and a lot less useful. But if you look at their tech level, let's see, mechs go down to 2. Paratroopers never get cheap. Yeah, you're never going to get paratroopers be a good purchase. So what paratroopers can be used as is they can be used as a one-time unit that are used in an advance attack. They're not destroyed necessarily if you make this attack, but they're only allowed to be used once per turn, and you can assign them as being used out of sort of the pile. So if you have, I don't know, if you have a chit for 4 paratroopers, that's an expensive thing. You could decide, well, I'm going to use 2 of them, and 2 of them are unused, and you'd mark that over on your paratrooper track somehow. You know, you don't have to remember it for long. It's only the course of your combat phase for that unit, basically. So the bonus of paratroopers is they count kind of like mechanized units, expensive mechanized units, but they count double. So if I launched 2 paratroopers, it would count as if I was using 4 mechanized units on the attack. If I fail to make it, though, I think they're destroyed, anyone I used for it. Now, the other really cool thing with them, though, is I can drop them to do an attack 1 hex away that I couldn't move over. I can do a landing. Instead of doing an amphibious assault, I can use paratroopers, or kind of in conjunction with, although the 2 attacks would be separate. They can't be combined in the same attack. In fact, they're not allowed to be in the same army. Okay, here's another one that can cause some real problems. Partisans. The Allied and Soviet player, even after surrender by the Soviets, can try to buy